I've been in practice for 30 years. We now have projects where landscape architects lead project teams. So architects, engineers, planners are sub-consultants to us, so that we lead large project teams.
Okay.
So the change in my lifetime even has been fairly profound.
So what places in the city are landscape architects responsible for?
All of it.
So even buildings themselves?
Yes, we can tell you where the buildings ought to be, what the buildings ought to do in terms of forming spaces, because it's often stated that cities are more to do with the spaces between the buildings than the buildings themselves. So it's not unusual for us to be preparing master plans and leading master plan teams for large sections of cities, which include drawing block plans, drawing figure ground plans for imaginary parts of the city which have not yet been built.
So when is a landscape project really finished?
Never. God will decide.
And
And similarly with architecture doesn't finish once the building is built. The building then becomes inhabited. The landscape then becomes inhabited. The landscape goes through seasons, but it also goes through different ecosystems begin to evolve in different landscape situations. Whether you're on the top of a mountain or the bottom of a valley, whether you're in the city or you're in a forest. Everything is moving all of the time.
Typically, when you would think of a landscape architect, you would think of that he always works with soil and earth and plants, but with what other materials do you work with?
There isn't a material that we don't work with. Glass, steel, timber, rubber, there isn't a material that we don't work with. So we have all of the materials that an architect or an engineer would work with, but we also have all of the plant kingdom, we have all of the water, we have the sky, we have the weather. We work with all of this. So there isn't a material that we don't work with.
Does it make easier or does it make harder if you have no borders at all?
I don't think it's different. I don't think it's different. If you are designing something where you have a firm basis for a concept, and you know which way that you want the design to go, then if you're referring to a selection of materials, then it's not a problem, because the concept that you've evolved and the narrative for a project, I think that narrative is very important, context is very important, that you will have made a decision about the materials almost by accident, if you like. But so it's not a limiting factor having all of the materials to work with.
And is it something that landscape architecture can learn from architecture, or also the other way around?
Yeah, we should all learn from one another all of the time. Some of my many of my design heroes are architects, but also landscape architects. But you can be inspired by writers, by musicians, by novelists, by poets. It's not just architecture and landscape which defines how we respond to culture or how we respond to place.
So in your office, what is your design process?
My goodness, what is a design process? It's about looking and seeing.
So what things do you look first?
Looking at the place where the project happens to be. If we assume that it's a project with a particular site, and that site is being defined, which is not always the case, but it's about looking at the context. You can read a piece of land in the same way that you can read a book, and each place will have a signature of the people who live there, and they will have made their own marks on that piece of land in their own way. So you need to decipher the language that they have used in a particular place. You get on a plane here in Manchester and you look out the window and you know that you're looking at a Cheshire landscape. You fall asleep and you wake up 2 hours later and you look out the window, you know that you're looking at a French landscape. Fall asleep again and you know that you're over northern Italy just by looking out of the window. Those landscapes have signatures. And they have a language. So if you learn the language of landscape and you become fluent, you can make your own story with it. But that's where it begins for me, is learning that language.
Do you think that there might be the danger of urbanization or globalization of landscape architecture that these typical cultural types get lost?
There is that danger in the hands of unskilled people, that you will get fashion victims, if you like. People will follow fashion in landscape as they do in architecture, so that a building that happens in Tokyo will look the same as a building that happens in Rio de Janeiro. It looks the same as a building that happens in Berlin. I think it's very important with landscapes in particular to understand the culture of the place that has made that landscape look and work the way it does. And then if you can express yourself in your own language, but you need to do that consciously. You don't do it flippantly or in a way which ignores or patronizes the context and the culture that you're working in.
Is landscape architecture increasing its responsibility for social issues?
Yes, and well, it's increasing, but it has always been important. It's very, very common from the early days of landscape architecture for landscape architects to be involved with community design issues, particularly in urban situations and particularly in low-income neighbourhoods. Landscape architects have been very, very active in environmental improvement works, even from the early days of the profession.
Normally in architecture, uses are people, but in landscape architecture, can you say that animals, plants are users as well that you have to take care of? And
they're all inhabitants. Users, I'm not very keen on the idea of user, but people people and organisms which inhabit a piece of work that you do. Sometimes there'll be no people. Sometimes that all of the inhabitants are going to be. They might be bears or wolves, but they might be earthworms or they might be fish. So all of the inhabitants are important. But I think that certainly human behaviour, when you're talking about city parks or squares or so on, human behaviour is important. And understanding the relationship of humans, particularly in collective situations, I think is important. And the idea of personal space. I sat this morning at 8:30, 9 a.m. in the car park in Chinatown, in the Chinese garden, as it's called, around the edge. So at 9 a.m. on the diagonal, I was sitting in sunshine on a beautiful little seat. So I was there in complete calm, in the middle of the city, in the best seat in town. So understanding, but the people who were walking through the square, they were walking past me because that was the diagonal route through the square. So all the behaviour was going on, the weather was going on, the city was going on, and I was going on as an individual. So understanding all of that in terms of human behaviour, but also the place and the nature of the place and the microclimate was all coming together. It's not a single issue.
Do you have any good advice for students nowadays, for architecture students specifically?
Wow. Your program, or part of your program, is called Continuity in Architecture. And there's a huge amount to learn from studying what people have done before, whether it happens to be in a modernist style or in a Renaissance style or a medieval style. So understand the roots of your profession, I suppose.